welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm doing the For the Love of Classics tag. I was tagged to do this tag by Dia from Novel Idea, and it was really funny because I was watching this tag video and thinking like, oh my gosh, I love these questions in this tag so much, and then I got to the end and she tagged me. So I was really excited, but she did tag me a while ago, and I just had so many different videos scheduled for different events that I'm just now getting around to it. I don't know who the original creator was of this tag, and Dia doesn't know either. So it's been going around BookTube for literally years. Like when I search for it on BookTube, it goes back like, 6-7 years. So this has been circulating for a really long time. So if you know who the original creator of this tag was, please let me know, because then I can pop it in the description of the video and give them credit for it. Let's go ahead and dive into the questions. So question number 1 is, why do you read classics and how often do you read classics? Which is technically 2 questions. But the first part of this question, why I read classics, I could create a whole video just surrounding that. And in fact, I've thought about doing that. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and maybe it'll be a video that comes out in the future. But Cliff's Notes version of why I read classics, number 1 is the language. Not only because I find it just so beautiful, but also it's educational because I often stumble across words that we no longer use frequently in our day-to-day lives. And so I really enjoy learning new words that way and that kind of stuff. But I just find the language itself really rich and beautiful. Speaking of richness, just in general, I find a lot of classics to be more meaningful and deep and rich than a lot of modern books. And I'm sure there are lots of modern books that are amazing and incredible and have that same depth and everything, but it's just harder to find them because there are so many books that are released every single year. And as a result of that, we don't know which ones are going to stand the test of time yet. We're kind of getting the best of classics because these are books that have stood the test of time. Another reason I love to read classics is I love the historical context that I receive when I am reading these books. So I'm learning about the time period it was written, or even sometimes there's historical fiction within classics. War and Peace is a great example that this was written after all of those things took place. And so it's interesting to be able to read, what their interpretation of that historical event was at the time as opposed to maybe what it is now, and combining that information, and it just kind of bridges this gap between where we are right now and the way things used to be, and connects with you in that way, which is really, really interesting. And another more probably shallow reason I do enjoy reading classics is there are content concerns that I have with a lot of modern books and things that I just prefer not to read that were very taboo and rarely seen in classic works. And that's not the same for everyone, because classic works have their own issues of things that were societally acceptable at the time that most certainly are not now, that would be very, very upsetting to a lot of people. And so that doesn't mean that classics are without their flaws. For sure, there are definitely still upsetting and badly written things or belief systems that we no longer adhere to, so that it's a good thing that we don't adhere to them anymore. But there are just certain things in particular that are especially disturbing or troubling to me, and oftentimes those specific situations are not found in classics. The other part of this question asks, how often do I read classics? I read at least 1 a month, but usually it's more than that. Usually it's several a month, but it is a weird month if I haven't read any classics. I can't even remember the last time that happened. Question number 2 is, what is a period/country/culture that you haven't read many classics from and would like to? In general, I would say translated classics. I've read a decent amount of translated Russian classics and translated French classics, but that's about it. I haven't really branched out a whole lot more than that, and I would really like to, particularly with like Asian countries and African countries and South American countries, which is why I chose the list that I did this year for my classics TBR. I decided I wanted to read around the world, and I actually have quite a few like South American classics on there, which is really cool. So it's harder for me to find Asian ones for some reason. That was my most difficult country to find translated classics from, but I have found several, and so that's really exciting because not only am I learning about a different culture entirely, but I'm learning historically about another culture, and that's really cool. Question number 3 is, what book do you think will be a classic? in 100 years time. And the first book that popped into my head was A Gentleman in Moscow, but Dia used that in her tag. So I wanted to come up with something different. But besides that, or maybe like Harry Potter, like I feel like that has shaped the genre of middle grade and of fantasy in so many ways that I really feel like that one's gonna be a classic, but I feel like those are really obvious. So I have a couple other suggestions here that may very well turn into classics within the next 100 years. One of those is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. I read this last summer and there are elements to it I didn't love, but I can see why this would easily become a classic because of the way that it's written. It takes place in the Congo and has definitely some historical context surrounding that, but it's about white Baptist missionaries who go to the Congo who really are just terrible people. Well, the father is anyway, that goes with his family. So it's difficult to read at times, and the ending is very literary in nature, but I can see that just based on like the quality of the writing and the way that it's written, I can really see that becoming a classic. An even more modern book that I could see potentially becoming a classic is Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which is a booktube darling, so I'm sure many of you have read this one, and it's translated from Japanese and it's very, very popular, and I think with good reason. I really, really loved it. I feel like it does such a great job of examining regret and relationships in like a very, very poignant and beautiful way. The next question is, what is the last classic that you read? The last classic that I completed is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, which I read last month, but I am currently almost done with Scaramouche by Raphael Sabatini. The next question is, what is the first classic that you ever read? And I could not tell you. I really don't know. I have a lot of childhood favorites that were classics, but I will tell you the first classic that I remember being incredibly, deeply impactful to me and caused me to love Victorian literature and to read Victorian literature frequently, and that was Silas Marner by George Eliot. When I was about 10 or 11, my dad read this out loud to me, and we had something that we would do when he would read to me every night before bed when I was young, but then when I started getting older and staying up later, he would read aloud to my mom and I. And so we went through many different books, and one of the first books that I remember him reading to both of us was Silas Marner, and that just, I loved it so much. We still have inside jokes, my mom and dad and I, surrounding this book, particularly because of different voices he would do or different things that he would say when certain words or certain names came up and all of that kind of stuff. And it was just a really special experience. And it was my first Victorian literature and just stoked a deep love and appreciation in my heart for Victorian literature. And that was the classic genre that I read most frequently and most widely until a few years ago. The next question is what is your favorite classics book cover? I do not have one. I can't think of one that I'm just like, that is it, the ultimate classics books cover. I don't have one. I really love Oxford World Classics because I just love how their covers look, and I think they choose beautiful artwork. So that's an edition that I really, really like. But basically any classic that looks really pretty, I am really into. And by pretty, I mean that it looks like old and beautiful. So I'm lifting this up as an example. This is not an old edition because it's like a Barnes & Noble edition, I think. But like any classic that looks like this, the spine is like, just looks so fancy and beautiful. This is like my ideal edition of books. The next question is classic authors you wish had written more books. And there's probably some obvious ones in here, and some of the people that I'm going to talk about, they did write more than one thing. This is not anyone who has just written one thing. It's just people that I wish had written more. And so first I want to say Flannery O'Connor, because she only ever wrote 2 full novels that were published. She wrote a lot of short stories though, but she died really young. I think she was 39 or 40 when she died, and I feel like the world was robbed that she died so young. Another author is Mary Shelley, and I know Mary Shelley wrote quite a few things, but she is most well known for Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is the only Mary Shelley book that I'm ever able to find widely. I would love to read more Mary Shelley, but it's really difficult to get your hands on a lot of her other books. And lastly, I'm going to say Mikhail Bogacov, who is known for writing The Master and the Margarita. He wrote actually quite a few more plays than he did novels, but he's written a couple of novels. I've only read The Master and the Margarita, and he's also written some short stories, but he didn't really write a whole a whole lot in comparison to many other Russian authors, and he wasn't widely published at the time, at least not within Russia. He was banned, his books were banned by Stalin because of, you know, the government at the time. And so a lot of them, like The Master and the Margarita, were actually not published until after his death. And so I really like his writing style, even though The Master and the Margarita feels like a fever dream for like half of it, and I still probably don't understand so much of it. But the first part of the book in particular, I feel like it's really interesting the way that he is choosing to portray Soviet Russia at the time. And so I think that because I'm so interested in that time period of Russian history, I think is part of the reason why I wish he had written more things. Question number 8 is, what is your least favorite classic? And I can very easily say Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, which is hilarious because one of my favorite classics of all time is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, also by Thomas Hardy. So Thomas Hardy is kind of like all over the board for me in terms of his writing. This was, I think, the third Thomas Hardy book that I had read, and I'm really, really glad it was not my first because I don't know if I would have ever read anything else by him. This is a very, very long book, and it's really, really funny because several of my friends, Penny and Stephanie, just recently read this and they were sharing their thoughts in my Discord, and I was here for all the drama and how much they hated this book. Mostly, you know, because, you know, the characters are really, really not likable, and it really just drags on. It's very long. But the main reason why I really, really hated this book is I hated the messaging that Hardy was trying to portray here. The reason I love Tess so much is because he's talking about inequality in gender roles in Victorian society, and it was, I think, revolutionary for its time. Something that I really hated about Jude the Obscure is it kind of feels like it backpedals on his opinion of women that he had in Tess of the D'Urbervilles and how unfair it is for women. One of the main messages is that, like, women just like to entrap men. Marriage is an entrapment, and women just think it's fun to toy with men's emotions. And I think that the book as a whole has some very strong anti-marriage sentiments, and also some really strong anti-religion and anti-Christianity sentiments. And I'm not a fan of that. So that is a huge reason why I disliked it. But there's one particular scene in this book, and if you've read it, you already know what it is. And I was reading this book, and I literally almost threw it across the room because I was so angry. And the only reason that I didn't was because it was a library book. And the only reason I finished it is because I was like, I've invested so much time in this book already. I might as well just go ahead and finish it. So without question, Jude the Obscure is my least favorite classic. The next question is, what is your favorite translated classic? And this actually was an easy question for me as well, and that would be Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This was my very first foray into Russian literature, and I love it so much. It's still my favorite Dostoevsky. I've read almost all of his works now. I've had a couple that have come close, but Crime and Punishment, maybe it's because it was the first, it's just very dear to me, and just love it. It was not at all what I was expecting, and I just kind of picked it up in a whim at the library. I'm like, oh, I've heard of this, and I love it so much. It's for sure my favorite Russian classic. Question number 10 is, what is your favorite modern classic? The definition that they are giving for modern classic is anything published after the year 1900, which is interesting because that's a lot earlier than most definitions that I've heard, but that's okay, we're going with it. This is really difficult for me because I have a lot of modern classic authors that I really, really love, especially like American writers. A lot of my favorite American writers are modern classic writers, but I think I probably have to go with Lord of the Rings because it is also my most reread classic, because I read the entirety of that trilogy every year from the year that I turned 12 until the year that I had my daughter, and I was, I think, 24 when I had my daughter. So yeah, so that's that's a lot of years of consecutively reading and loving and not getting sick of Lord of the Rings. Question number 11 is, what classic literary places would you like to visit? And the first would be Middle Earth for sure, which just dovetails perfectly from the last question, most specifically the Shire before all the events of Lord of the Rings. So before it's all torn apart, before war hits in that way, I would really love to visit the Shire. But if we're going with a non-fantastical place, my other answer has to be Manderley from Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I don't want to go when Mrs. Danvers is there, and I don't really want to go actually when any of them live there. at all. It's just really beautiful the way that it's described and where it is and all the lush nature around it. I would really love to go there, but I don't want to go there when they're there. Question number 12 is, what is the first classic that you would recommend to a child? This is really difficult because it would really depend on the child. My favorite classic growing up, without a doubt, was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So that absolutely has to make this list. It's so beautiful and so wonderful and very magical, and I loved it so much. So I really, really, really recommend that one. I also really recommend Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery, because a lot of people might think like, oh, this is a girl's book, and it's really not. The level of humor in Anne of Green Gables is phenomenal. Like, you will laugh. Any child of any age will laugh, I think, a lot at Anne of Green Gables. Both of those are really well-known and well-loved classics. So I'm going to also recommend one that's a little less well-known, and that's Along Came a Dog by Maynard de Jong, I think how you pronounce his last name. This is not a book that he's well-known for. He's well-known for The Wheel on the School, which is also excellent, but I really love Along with the Dog. If your child loves animals, I think that they would really like this one a lot. It is about this chicken who unfortunately has something happen where the other chickens are picking on her and stuff, and she actually ends up losing like some of her toes, so she can't be on her perch at night anymore, and so she's very much not liked by the other chickens. And this man is taking care of her, and this big black dog shows up, and this man is like, what is this dog doing here? And he's afraid it's gonna hurt the chickens, so he keeps driving it away. But this black dog develops this friendship and this love for this little red hen and is taking care of her and protecting her. And it's just really sweet, and I really love it a lot. It's not one of those ones where like animals are talking and all of that kind of stuff. You're just kind of, I mean, you know what they're feeling and what they're thinking, but it's not like, oh, the animals are talking and they're best friends and they're going on adventures together and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's not like that. It's very different from that, but I think it's really special. I think it's also currently out of print, unfortunately, which I think is a shame, but a lot of libraries still carry it. That's how Claire and I read it, is that we got it from the library. The next question is super fun. Question number 13 is classics you think are mistitled, and what would you title them? Something you see a lot in classics is that there are a lot of classics that share the name with the main character. I've already mentioned Silas Marner. I think a lot of like Charles Dickens had that, like Oliver Twist and Little Dorrit, and you know, there are lots of classics. Frankenstein, you know, that have the main character's name, and that is your title. The one I think is really mistitled is Anna Karenina. And yes, Anna is one of the main characters of this story, but we're not following her the whole time. The story is like really divided between her and then her cousin's friend, Levin. So yeah, the two of them do interact, but most of the time our narrative is split between them and they're not at the same place at the same time all of the time. And I would actually say that Levin's arc in this story is one of the best that I've read in all of literature, and I find his story to be so redemptive, so beautiful, and was my favorite part of the story. And you wouldn't even know from the title that he has anything to do with this at all. Not really sure what I would name it otherwise, because I'm trying to think like thematically if there's a good name or something. Like maybe Unfulfilled. Maybe I'd name it Unfulfilled, because that is definitely a theme of thinking you want something and it's not as fulfilling as you think it is. And Levin is spending so much of this book searching for meaning and whether or not God exists and like all these kinds of things. And so maybe I would change it to that. A book that I've read recently that I think has a stupid title is The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. So the aforementioned native in the title who returns from afar does not even come into the book until you are like a third or more of the way through. And I don't think that the return of the native is actually really like the theme of the book. Like, this guy has been away, he does come back, and his coming back does stir up some things, and that kind of gets the ball moving on some of the drama, but the drama's already happening before he even gets there. And I think that a good title for Return of the Native, actually, I think this title would also apply to Middlemarch as well, is like, why premarital counseling is important. And you should actually talk about what you want out of life before you marry someone. I think that could be the title of so many books. It's a little wordy though. I guess Return of the Native's a bit more catchy. Last question is, what is a favorite classic of yours that you would recommend to everyone? And that feels a little bit impossible because I don't feel like every classic is for every person. So that's a really hard question for me. For me, I do think Crime and Punishment is up there, and that is one of my favorite books of all time, just because I think that really everyone should try it. It may not be for you, but I think that Russian literature has a reputation of being really difficult and really hard to read and very philosophical, and there's a lot of philosophical things in Crime and Punishment, but it was so different than anything that I expected. And it's also not as long as some of Dostoevsky's work as well, and doesn't have like quite as many characters as some of his other books, and so I think it can be a little bit easier to follow than some of his other works. I think most of the other books that I would recommend and say that everyone should give a try to are ones that are probably even more well known than Crime and Punishment. Books like Anne of Green Gables, some of Jane Austen's works, I think I would be highly recommended. I would recommend Charles Dickens, which a lot of people are intimidated by, and I don't think he's quite as scary. I don't think you need to be as scared as some people might tell you that you should be. But I don't know what else I would recommend. I'm not really sure that if there's anything else I would recommend that isn't well known already. I'd love to hear what you guys think. What is a classic book that you think that everyone should read? Because that's really difficult to recommend a book to everyone, because not everyone likes the same thing or the same genre. But I do think that there is a classic book out there for everyone. So if you don't really like the wordiness of Dickens, there's a lot more concise authors out there. If you're more interested in fantasy or sci-fi, there are classic versions of that. There are classics that are dark. There are classics that are light-hearted and encouraging and humorous. And there are classics that are so deep and meaningful that you will probably think about for the rest of your life. And so there's so many different varieties. So I don't think I could ever tell someone like every single person should read this book, because that's really hard to say. The last question is to tag some people, but because this tag has been around for years and years and years, I feel like a lot of people have already done it. So I'm not really sure who to tag in this. If this is something that you're interested in, something you would like to talk about on your channel that you haven't yet, talking about classics in this way, I would love it if you would do this tag and then tag me, so that way I can see your answers as well. Feel free to share some of your answers in the comments below if you would like to. I will have all the questions for this tag in the descriptions, that way you can find them there. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.